let me bring up Jenn Lim. So when we show up authentically at work, we can bring our whole selves, which benefits everyone on our team. When leaders encourage others to bring their whole selves and unique perspectives to each situation, solutions are creative, innovation happens, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging flow naturally. So Jenn Lim, co-founder, CEO, and Chief Happiness Officer at Delivery Happiness, will share how leaders can make this happen in their organizations. And I'm going to bring back our very own Zara. And I just have to say, Jenn, you have the most uplifting title I've ever heard, Chief Happiness Officer. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Take it away, Zara.
Thank you so much, Hunter. Jenn, I echo Hunter's sentiments. I am so excited to chat with you. I think that is the best title I've heard in a while. So welcome. We're happy to have you here to really talk about this concept of being able to bring our whole selves to work and how that can really transform organizations. So to start off, why is it worth our effort to facilitate authenticity within the workplace?
Yeah, I think if you just kind of zoom out a little bit, and it was important before 2020, and then we all got 2020'd, and then 2021. And so now even more than ever, it's kind of we were already kind of inching towards that place of being authentic in work and therefore in life. But I think in light of all that happened to us on a global stage at one time, really gave us, in some ways, the luxury of time because we were in Zoom land and couldn't go to work, to actually reprioritize and think about, am I spending my moments most meaningfully in my life? And of course, someone's at my door. Yay, live. But hopefully they'll just drop it off. But so, yeah, I think because we were presented with those questions, am I prioritizing right? Am I spending my minutes most meaningfully with the people I love, including myself? And oftentimes, I think the answer was no. And that's why we're seeing the Great Resignation, Great Reset, great whatever you want to call it. But that's why I think the priority is so high, spotlighted more than ever, to really be who we are, whether we're wearing our work hat or not.
Yeah. I love that. And also, yes, life happens.
So doorbells during life.
Yeah. Like you said, it's Zoom land, anything really goes. But I really love this idea and this concept of authenticity. And so, Jenn, just so you know, I am on the DEIB team at Power to Fly. So we're always thinking about these things. We're always talking about them. So I'm super excited to dive into this a little bit further with you. So my next question for you is really around systems. And so how can leaders begin creating systemic environments where we can meaningfully connect and really feel this sense of belonging?
Yeah, so I'm really a big proponent of systems because, number one, just give you the why, especially being in the happiness space, being in the culture space. A lot of the times these things can be construed as, here's a program, let's be happy, and then be done with it. But unless they're made into systems, then they're kind of a fleeting, short-term gain versus a long-term change, especially from a DIB angle or lens to our work environments. So I think systems come into place by thinking about what is it that we can put into are operationalized in our organizations in a sustainable way. And this gets really non-sexy, right? Because we're talking about org design and putting in the right policies and rules and all that we have to have as rigor, but giving it the freedom of people to be autonomous and basically, make their own decisions and to have a sense of control. So there's a few tenets to creating the systems. One is having a sense of accountability, and that's just answering the question, what's in it for me and what's in it for all simultaneously. Another one, of course, is the belonging sense. Everyone has a voice, even though if you're not extroverted, and being able to provide the communication mechanisms where everyone can be heard. Third one is alignment. And a huge part of this is making sure whatever your personal purpose values are aligned to that of the organization or your team in the very least. Because then at least, no matter what you're bringing to the table, at least you know that you share something very, very deeply important to you. i.e. your purpose and values. And with that, a sense of long-term commitment. And that's when you create a more systemic change versus the short-term gains that we see a lot in culture and HR and people changes.
Yeah. And I love even like that you brought that into the space, right? That longevity factor where it's not you for something to be sustainable, you got to build a system behind it. So I love that you kind of like named that. I think that's super important, especially when we talk about like what might be considered more abstract concepts, right? Of like belonging or like authentic, like what does that mean? You know, putting systems behind that I think is so crucial. So I love that. So in your work, speaking of systems, you talk about people ecosystems. So how would you define a people ecosystem, and how can we create healthy ones that really enable people to feel more human at work?
Yeah. So the things that I just rattled off are basically the pillars of what an ecosystem can be. But instead of rattling them off again, I'd love to give the metaphor because they get really inspired by nature. And, you know, we had done some time to get onto to our local parks and all that. And I live in the Bay Area, so pretty close to the redwoods, sequoias, you know, beautiful trees, very majestic. But what's really interesting is the system that sustains them, because they're like the tallest trees on the planet, and really robust, really resilient. And I'm like, well, how can we learn from that and learn from basically anything that really sustains itself in nature? So what I learned when I was researching the book is that even though the tallest trees in the world, they actually have really short root systems. And the reason why they're able to sustain that height is because they're all interconnected. So if we think about those pillars that I thought about, these tallest trees, really short systems or root systems actually work because they help each other. So in a sense, if one tree is lacking some sort of nutrient or sap or something, the other trees actually rally behind the other tree to make sure that it grows. Another interesting thing they did was that they did a study where they put a droplet of some sort of dye, as a colored dye, into one corner of the forest. And eventually it reached all to the other end of the forest after several years later. Yeah, hopefully the dye was organic, because that would have really sucked, because there goes also the whole forest. But this is all to show that here is a system of very sustainable environment of these healthy trees that actually are more resilient. Even after a fire, they can actually rebuild themselves because they are all interconnected and essentially have a sense of community and a sense of belonging, because if one doesn't survive, then the others might not as well.
I love that. I love that you brought nature into this. I think there's so many great examples in nature of like how things work together. So I love this example of like the sequoias. Also, I did not know that about their root system. So thank you for also introducing some knowledge around that as well. So I love that. I'm definitely going to be using that analogy. So it can be easy to focus on authenticity as a shortcut to efficiency. How is this missing the point? And what should the intention of authenticity be?
Yeah, so I think the intention really comes back to, if you're thinking about it from like, if you're a lead of a team or a lead of organization, or you just want to be a leader of you, like what we have known and seen throughout centuries now. And, you know, I'm a bit biased towards the science of happiness, not just rainbows and unicorns, but scientific happiness. What's the data, positive psychology have shown us. And so what we've learned is that the ways to be sustainably happy, like intrinsically, not, you know, extrinsically, more money, more pay, that all that, or, you know, more perks, all that stuff. To be intrinsically happy is to have a sense of purpose, number one, that's the most sustainable form, but is also to have a sense of inherent disposition, as Aristotle called it, inherent disposition of who you were when you were born. And basically, as a child growing up, and then the years that come in that with environmental changes and things that happen to you and happen for you in your life, it affects your core, your authenticity. So I think that's a big reason why when we work on it, we get to realize who we really are and what we really are meant to be here for. And so that's why in a workplace situation, of course, we want people to be that way, because we want them to feel like they own their role. They love it no matter what job they have. I have an example of someone that's a receptionist at a doctor's office. She's like the happiest person in the world. And everyone's like, what's going on with this woman? And her title on her business card reads, Director of First Impressions. And for her, that means everything. That's the role she wants to own. So anyway, that's authenticity in work, and how it could be real for you.
I love the example you just gave about like the person's title really, like, it could easily have said receptionist, but like the
Right.
fact that it's really the director of first impression, I love that. I love that. And also just responding to what you were talking about now, it also pulls in what you were mentioning earlier around values, right? And like really bringing your values to work and being
Yeah,
able to be authentic around that as well. Like all these things, just build off of one another.
totally.
So really, as we look towards the future of work, right? So let's shift a little forward thinking. What will organizations that don't facilitate authenticity and humanity, what will they really
Mhm.
look like in years to come? And how can leaders avoid those outcomes?
Yeah. So what has been the silver lining? One of the many silver linings, I think, of 2020 in the last couple of years. We went through a lot of hardship, but seeing that the future of work has basically been expedited to now. It's no longer the future.
Yeah,
Like the future of work of remote
that's fair.
work or AI or VR or technology and disruptive all this technology stuff in inseminating all of our global um, uh, ecosystems and um, economic systems. But basically, that's been giving us a big glimpse into the future being now. And so that's why I think we can't think about it in the future anymore. Companies now need to be making major choices and decisions as to where they want to draw the line as to whether or not they want to make whole, authentic environments for authentic people today. So I think that's where we're already seeing changes, where companies that decided to say, you don't have a choice, it's come to work, it's no, there's no more remote, there's no more hybrid. And then you see again the whole great resignation. I mean, it's startling. I think just 2 days ago, the reports that came out from the Labor Bureau said that there was the highest number of people quitting ever since this data started getting collected in 20 years ago, which is like 4.5 million in a month. But what's also really interesting is that we have the highest number of job openings and vacancies available. So what is that telling us? Like at the same time people are quitting, at the same time there's more opportunities in some ways. And then so how are employers or teams or managers going to navigate that? And I think now that if we see it that way, we have more choices. And if we want to align it to who we are as purpose and values standpoint, then those are the companies that will be actually more sustainable, like the redwoods in the forest, like more sustainable in this time and age, not the future, but now.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you were like, yeah, so we're gonna rephrase this question to right now because
Yeah,
the
it
future is
is.
happening right. That's totally a fair point. And I'm glad you named that. And I think yeah, this is a great discussion. I'm kind of excited to continue chatting about this with you. So you had already started talking a little bit about like what how healthy work environment might look like. I'm just curious to hear like what according to you is a
Mm.
healthy work environment that not only allows you to be your authentic self, but also really allows you to achieve the potential that might come from that.
You know what? I think it's so I've been, pipe in purpose and values alignment a lot. And I think number one, that's sort of like uh number like 101 in terms of creating that healthy environment. What I also think is really important, especially right now for healthy environments, is psychological safety. And that's the sense of being able to show up, hey, look, I am having a crappy day. And being able to say why, or being able to ask someone, look, you're acting really weird right now. Like, is there anything I can do? Or instead of assuming the worst of like, oh my gosh, this person's being a total, blank. So psychological safety is actually interesting aspect of being like feeling like you can have those kind of mental emotional conversations. And it's really interesting, like Google did this fascinating study on their own company to try and understand what the most efficient teams are. And then it was like a study of over, I don't know, 30, 40,000 employees, so and over a course of many years. And what they found was, what you wouldn't think the typical thing. It was like, oh yeah, it was their manager or it was their systems. It was the fact that the teams that had the most psychological safety were actually the most effective and in the end, authentic to who they are. So I think that's really telling as to how we can do it as well in our own teams and organizations too.
Yeah. And again, like all of these things, they build off one another, right? Like we can't even talk about someone, feeling a sense of belonging in their workplace if there isn't psychological safety, right? So like
Yeah.
that's such a key crucial part of that as well.
Yeah.
You know?
And then to build on what you just said is to make sure you embed that into your systems, because you can say it, we can say, hey, we are DIB, or hey, we're psychologically, but if you're not recognizing and rewarding, and therefore calling out when it's not being when it is a psychologically unsafe environment, then it's not truly systemic.
Yeah. No, I love that you brought back the systems. Like, I think, again, so many of these concepts can just be abstract and be lost in the wind if we're not building the structures beneath them, right? To make sure, like you said, it's embedded in the company, like for longevity, right? It's not just something that we did one off and like, okay, check a box, we did it, right? But how are we really embedding it in the system? Like you said, the root system of the sequoia, like that's not something that's happened like overnight, right? That's something that got built over a long time. So like, how are we envisioning that, learning from that and really building the systems out? I was also just thinking about what you were talking about in terms of the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffle. Like so much of that, I feel, is because people are realizing that they don't need to necessarily settle. Like I feel like the pandemic was almost a wake-up call, I feel, for a lot of individuals in terms of what they're willing to settle for or compromise in the workplace. And I'm curious, like if you have seen sort of an increase or what you think about people's like levels of authenticity as well, like when they're shifting job. Like, do you think that that's something that individuals are really looking for in the new workplace, or what are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, the question is whether or not they want to shift.
The question is, as individuals are looking to shift careers and shift, especially with the Great Reshuffle, the Great Resignation happening, like, do you feel like individuals are really seeking like workplaces that allow them to be more authentic, or what do you think they're really looking for?
I think in some ways they don't necessarily name it as that, like, oh, I want to be more real at work.
Right.
But when they, when we do ask ourselves if someone's looking to switch or in the middle of looking, already switching and trying to find the new path, I think when you name the things that you're looking for, like more flexibility or more control at work, or even more pay, still fits too a lot of the time. And what's a big reason why coming out of the Great Resignation is a greater sense of purpose. It's just like, having all that time to think about, am I really spending these minutes in this Zoom room or, in this role? And does it give me any purpose? So if you call all those things out and you answer all those questions for yourself, at the end of the day, it pretty much ladders up to being more authentic to who you are and what you want to live a more meaningful life.
Yeah, I love that. Also, bring it back to the values, like you said, right? Like all of that, like you said, you named it. It all feeds into this larger sort of feeling of authenticity. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit from like the larger, systems that we're talking about, and more to you as an individual, and would love to sort of see if you have any advice for women or non-binary individuals who are really trying to be their authentic selves, especially, at the beginning of their career. Like, what advice would you give those folks?
Wow, it's such a different environment from when I started out, because I just remember that I was trying to fit in. And maybe because I had my insecurities going in, as I went to Cal, Berkeley. I was supposed to be doctor, lawyer. I mean, everyone in this audience knows all that story, so I'm not going to go through that. But after saying no to that and basically majoring in Asian American studies, like essentially the absolute worst nightmare of your parents, when I told them, they're like, "What? Are you serious?" They're like, "Come home more often. We'll tell you what your Asian American studies life is all about." But in hindsight, I mean, I majored in it anyway, but in hindsight, it was the first time I made an intentional step to do what I thought was true to myself and not what others have expected of me. So that kind of leads into what your question. My reflection going back then, like, I wasn't being myself because I thought I had to make up for things that I was lacking, because I wasn't, I didn't major in business, and I didn't have like that pedigree or technology or engineer. So that made me feel like I had to prove myself in some way. And now that, so much time has passed from those days of, because I was born and raised in the .com days, from a work sense, like I was like, oh my God, this is easy. I was making money, I was like, I had the title and status. And then as we know, the .com busted and everything was taken away almost overnight. And then I realized like, whoa, a lot that I thought I was working my ass off for just got removed by someone else that doesn't really care that much. So at that point forward, then I realized, and then this is also in tandem with finding out my dad getting stage 3 colon cancer. So getting laid off, eventually losing my dad pretty soon after, it all hit me that I was chasing the wrong stuff. And I had to reprioritize what was most important. And, not by accident, that's why I talk about purpose and values, because then I realized what my values were. It was people, freedom, and authenticity. That's what I discovered at that time. So that's what I would, I guess, recommend for people that are in tweening right now or just coming out of school. Remember, there's always those things that are going to be outside your control, but what you can control within is what means the most. And that's why it's so important to do the work.
Yeah. And thank you so much for like sharing that sort of experience and like your past history. Like, I know that, yeah, I just appreciate you kind of honestly naming that and bringing that into the space. So we did have a question from the audience for you, which was, has there been any particular experience in your career that has completely transformed your outlook and motivated you to keep going? So I know you mentioned a personal sort of experience. Curious if there's, another sort of professional experience that really transformed your outlook.
Wow, there's just been so many different series of like ups and downs throughout. I think maybe one step of transformation was when my co-founder and I launched Delivering Happiness in 2010. But I think the transformation of that was just that transformative aspect of that moment was that years leading up to that, I was like making career decisions based on trying to be authentic to myself and my purpose of, as I was laying out at that time, being able to leverage who I am to help others. And now it's a more concrete way, but I blew my mind that I could actually create a company around this thing called happiness. And this is 2010. So now it's a little less like, whatever, like that sounds great wherever you are, but not here. But so now I have the luxury of being able to talk about happiness, being able to talk about love and care and in the workplace and not make it sound like 4-letter words of like, what are you talking about? Being able to talk about DIB and like specific things that are germane to us as individuals. Whatever you want, even though there's a spectrum of things we want to identify ourselves with, but at least now we can actually name them and identify with all of them in a time that's at least better than before, knowing we have a lot of work to do. Yeah. So I think that was transformative. Wow, a happiness company. And then 10 years later, then we were like one of the fastest growing Inc. 5000 companies in the country, right before COVID hit, of course. But and then we had to do a whole nother set of things. But I think those are the big things. Like, wow, I can follow my purpose and values, create something out of it. And, have to be business minded, have to be people minded, have to be profit minded, but then actually create something that I just never even conceived of being or dreaming when I was growing up.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to think back to that time when you built this business. Was such a different time in many ways, where a lot of even the conversation we're having today would have maybe not happened back then, So what an inspiration that you really followed through on this dream of yours and created something at a time when maybe it wasn't as normalized. So, just really kudos to you for following your dream and passion and really making it happen, especially at a time when before this was something that people talked about more often. So
yes, thank you.
No, definitely, Jenn. It has been such a pleasure like having you here, really hearing a little bit more about your approach and your thoughts. I'd love to see if you had any sort of final words of wisdom or any final thoughts that you'd like to impart on our audience before we wrap up.
I think the biggest thing that I've learned and is that, especially in these last 2 years, I keep on saying that because having gone through, this global 2020, I had to write a book. I lost my co-founder and one of my best buddies in the end of 2020. And through that process, I got back to this place of this mantra, which is remember to nurture your greenhouse, nurture your own greenhouse as you try to grow others. And others meaning people, other meaning career, other meaning relationships in general, because it's the whole, oxygen mask thing in an airplane. And maybe we forgot because we don't fly as much anymore, but now we're starting to again. And just it sounds and feels counterintuitive to, I got to save myself before, what a narcissist, but it's not true. Like, because if you go, you're going to save yourself, if we're not going to save yourself before others, then your plane is going to go down sooner or later.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest things I've been learning and wanting to develop more in my life.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of self-care is so important, right? Like, how can we pour into others if we're empty ourselves? I love that you brought that into this conversation too, because I especially like within API like cultures as well, that this concept of self-care is not necessarily something that's very prioritized, or even like folks don't feel empowered to do that. We're so busy being taught to take care of others, and I think that's so important, right? That self-care aspect that you're really talking about professionally, but also like personally.
Yeah, well, I believe in work-life integration, so I think it has to be both.
Absolutely. Jenn, it has been such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for sharing such insight. Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to hearing more and seeing more of your company.
Awesome. Thank you for the insightful questions.
Absolutely.